privacy and inclusion, המקדש, בביאה, משום פריצות. The whole idea of globalization and its relationship to a lot of other things that are happening in the world. And of course, there are many advantages to globalization, but there's a force. Melanie Phillips wrote an article recently on the linkage between the forces of globalization, the EU, the World Economic Forum and others, and the forces of gender convergence. Just as there's a force to obliterate the differences between nations, so there's a force to obliterate the differences between genders, to obliterate all differences. The force for diversity and inclusion in businesses, part of it is very positive and constructive. Elements of it aren't. And that relationship of breaking down barriers that define individuals, barriers that define groups of individuals, even the forces against Israel. She includes in her research as to some of the forces that are driving it. And one has to understand there can't really be inclusiveness unless there is exclusiveness. If everybody's allowed in, then by letting people in, you're not being inclusive. There's no exclusion. Inclusiveness, it's quite paradoxical. You can only have inclusiveness if you have exclusiveness. If only certain people are allowed in and I invite more people in, I'm including them. But if everybody's allowed in, then there is no barrier, there's no reshut hayachid. And what we're talking about here are the differences between reshut hayachid, a person or a community's or a nation's private domain, and the public domain, the global domain, where everybody is comfortable and is about. There's a difference between them. And we're going to understand the concept of pריצות. So pריצות is a term that's used widely and loosely, but what does it really mean? People say, pריצות, what does it mean, pריצות? So it varies from community to community. For some people, pריצות would be if the mechitza in the shul is not completely opaque. For some people, pריצות is men and women dancing together at a wedding. For some people, pריצות is worse than that. What that level of pריצות is, and what does pריצות really mean, as we'll see in this piece, pריצות is the breaking down. פורץ means to break a barrier, לפרוץ, to break out. pריצות is breaking down the barrier that differentiates רשות היחיד from רשות הרבים, private domain from public domain. Private domain is that space where you can be yourself without worrying about how you are seen by others. Reshut hayachid is that private space where you're involved with the building of your identity, not of your image. Your image is the way other people see you. Your image is external. Your image is a structure. And when you're in Reshut harabim, part of your mind is always occupied with your image. How are people seeing me? How am I coming across? How are people understanding me? How are people perceiving and experiencing me? But if you're in Reshut hayachid, if you're behind closed doors, just you and Hashem, then it's not about image. It's about who I really am, not who do I look like. If one's learning in yeshiva and one's learning lishma, then one's building one's identity, one's building one's inner world, one's building one's inner self. But when you go to school and to your college and to university, you're building your outer self. You're building tools with which to operate in the world. You're building a way to be seen and accepted in the world. And when we're in business, most of the time we're occupied with Reshut harabim, with how we interact with the world. So most of our lives is around building our capacity for the public domain, for Reshut harabim. When do we really develop ourselves as individuals? We do that in infancy. And if one goes to yeshiva and one's completely engrossed in just Torah lishma, one's learning just for its own sake, not she'ekarei Rebbe, you're not learning in order to get a job, you're not learning in order to be called a rabbi, you're not learning for status, you're learning just for your own inner being, for your own inner self, then you're building identity, you're building your inner world. And we need more opportunity to do that, but you can only build your inner world if you have a geder, if you have a fence around your inner world, into which you include people very selectively. But when you poretz geder, when one breaks those fences down and there is no difference between public and private domain, that's called pריצות. And as much as we're talking about globalism, we were saying that in globalism there are certain advantages. It's not a black and white situation, but this force of driving globalization. At the end of the day, nationalism means there are negatives to nationalism. We've seen enough of that. We understand that. But also nationalism enables a nation to preserve its culture, a nation to preserve its values, to operate one of the many serious debates in Eretz Israel today. Are we going to be a democratic country without boundaries, basically? Or are we going to be a Jewish country? Jewish country means it's a Reshut HaYachid for Jews. It's a place where Jews can live as Jews. And that means that we're going to restrict inclusion. We're not going to include everybody. But that's not democratic, because the world of globalization pushes the removal of national boundaries and the removal of personal boundaries, gender boundaries. You can't even say that a child that's just been born is a boy. Who are you to say it's a boy? Give it a chance to decide whether it wants to be a boy or not, because you're creating a boundary, you're closing it in. So there's this force in the world today of obliterating the boundary between Reshut HaYachid and Reshut HaRabim. And without that boundary, the inner world of a person, of a family, of a community, and of a nation cannot be built. Even a shul, if a shul belongs to a community, it's not just inclusive that anybody walks in and behaves however they want. A shul has certain standards, it has certain values, certain codes of behavior. People who are willing to behave according to those codes of behavior are welcome in. People who are not welcome in. That's exclusiveness. There's a certain exclusiveness to that. Yiddishkeit, not everybody just becomes a Jew. Theoretically one can, if one accepts the rules of the Reshut HaYachid. If you're willing to behave in our private domain as people in the private domain behave, then it's acceptable. But not just everywhere. You can't just walk in and behave any way you want to. So this debate about Reshut HaYachid and Reshut HaRabim is foundational in individual development, in family, in community, and in nationhood, as to what those boundaries are and how one operates within Reshut HaRabim and within Reshut HaYachid. And when in Reshut HaRabim you behave in a way that you should only behave in Reshut HaYachid, that's called Prizut. If in the public domain you behave as though you're in the private domain, that's called Prizut. You've broken down the barriers. You've broken down. So this is a very important piece of learning that we'll have today. It's been sponsored by Moshe Isaacson of Ra'anana. Some of you might know Moshe Isaacson as the man who opened and ran for many years Meatland, which has kept a lot of the Olim happy with their nostalgic memories of their homelands, and we're sad to know that he's having to close it. Some of you might know Moshe Zimmerman because you might have got a traffic ticket from him. You might know him as the chief of the traffic department in Ra'anana, and some of you might know him for the enormous chesed and tzedakah that he does, particularly for Olim in Ra'anana, people who come to Ra'anana. So thank you, Moshe. We hope that you'll be part of the daily live Matmonim. I know that you listen to the Matmonim every single day, but we would welcome you to be included in the Reshut HaYachid of the Matmonim program. There's a Reshut HaRabim on the Matmonim program. It's out on YouTube. That's Reshut HaRabim. But there's Reshut HaYachid where there's a closed door. We're sitting in the Beis HaMedrash and some people come and other people don't. That's a Reshut HaYachid. And we would welcome you into it. He's not sponsoring in memory of anybody, but I'm humbled to say, in honor of Rabbi Lapin, who brings the Gemara to life, blends it with current topics. May Hashem bless you with much health, happiness, and continued wisdom to continue giving of yourself as you do. Thank you, Mesh. The Gemara talks about various different behaviors that Rav used to punish people for, although they were not technically halachically wrong. And the Gemara goes through it. Then the Hadai says, "Bekula lo menagid Rav." Rav didn't punish people for any of these bad behaviors, excepting Ela al de mekadesh b'viya belo shiduchi. If a person does Kiddushin, we've spoken about the last day or two, you can do Kiddushin with kesef, with money. You can do Kiddushin with shtar, with a document. And you can do Kiddushin with biah, with intimacy. But if somebody chose to do Kiddushin with biah, he says, as we had the case yesterday or the day before, he takes two witnesses to the hotel, he takes his bride into the hotel room, they lock the door, and he says to the witnesses, "I'm being mekadesh, my wife, bevia, and you are my edim. This is for the sake of Kiddushin." If somebody did that, technically okay, the Kiddushin is a valid Kiddushin. There are many things which are technically okay, but essentially rotten. And says Rav, that's one of the cases that Rav used to punish people for, even though that it's a method of Kiddushin, first Mishnah of Masechta Kiddushin. Below Shiduchi, it was done without Shiduchim. Shiduchim means a prior engagement. So there's several steps necessary before biah, before intimacy. The one is chuppah. So first you bring the woman into your home and in public, the chuppah. And then there is, before that even, there's Kiddushin. You're mekadesh the woman. And before that, there's Shiduchim. You get engaged to the woman. You make an agreement that you're going to get married. And we'll see in a moment why those levels are important. But those are three barriers. Those are three fences that protect the Reshut HaYachid of the marital home. And to bring a woman into the marital home where you can behave with her as one who is in Reshut HaYachid, requires crossing these various barriers to get into the sanctum sanctorium of the home that is protected by these various different barriers. And some say that even if there were shidduchim, so there was an engagement, but he chooses to marry his wife using the mechanism of biah, that was also a case that Rav used to punish people for. Why? Misum pritzuto, because that is pritzus. The Ritva uses a different term, and he talks about it as chutzpah, which is interesting. I'm not sure why he changes the meaning of the word from, or he gives it that meaning, that pritzus is chutzpah. What is chutzpah? Chutzpah is also crossing barriers, behaving in ways that aren't appropriate for where you are, for the space in which you are, for the time in which you are, for the relationship in which you are. But Tosfos learns it pritzus itself, and there are two reasons that Tosfos brings as to why this is pritzut. The one is, Rabbi Lapin says, because it's pritzut to ask Eidim to watch while you take a woman into a private, it's private. The whole idea of asking Eidim, asking witnesses to watch you going into a private place with a woman, that's kind of tati desatri. It's opposite. The whole idea is you're taking into Rishut HaYachid. What are Eidim doing there? And Tosfos asks, but we see by Yibum that it's allowed. By Yibum, the way that a person is, in Yevamot we learned that, the way that a Yabam is koneh his Yevamah, the way in Yibum that the kinyan takes place is with biah, is with intimacy, and according to some that has to be Eidim, must see them going into privacy, so be able to bear witness to the fact that they were intimate and private together. So we see there's nothing wrong with asking Eidim to watch something which is halachically required. Re-answers, and in Yevomis, Rabbi Lapin himself adopts this. So this is Rabbi Lapin and go through the thinking and then come to the conclusion, Dahainu pritzut she'osim tchilat kinyanan b'vi'ah. Doing the first kinyan, the first act of engagement, of investment in a woman, the first thing you do, you're still in Rishut HaRabim, she's not in your home yet. How are you bringing her into your home? With biah, but biah should be done in a home. You're not in your home yet. You haven't gone through the steps to bring her into your home. So to engage with biah, with intimacy with a woman who is not yet in your private area, that's pritzut. Dumya de mekadesh below shiduchi. That's like being mekadesh without shiduchin. And the Rambam says that's even if you do a mekadesh bekesef. You give a woman a ring with a proper wedding and everything. You haven't had an engagement period. There's been no shiduchim. You're in vacation on, where were you, Dr. Howard? In Ireland. You're on vacation in Ireland or in Las Vegas, and you meet a beautiful woman, and you get on well, and you say, come, let's not waste any time. Let's go to the special shul in Las Vegas that is dedicated for quick weddings, and let's have a snap wedding there. And she schleps her off to this place, and they get a rabbi, and they get witnesses, they get a few people. Arayat Mekudeshitli says, that's dumya de mekadesh below shiduchi, that's pritzut. Even that's pritzut. It's a kosher wedding, everything's good. But it's pritzut. It wasn't done with the right process of bringing the woman from public to private domain, where she can become intimate with the man. This idea we see also in the Rambam, the famous Rambam at the beginning of Hilchot Ishut. Kodem matan Torah haya adam pogea isha b'shuk. Im ratzahu v'hi lisa ota machnisa lebeito voila. Before Matan Torah, a man met a woman, he liked her, they wanted to get married, he would take her into his home and have relations. And then she's his wife. So once the Torah was given, it starts with ratzon. A man must want it. He must want to marry this woman. Step one. When he's done that, he does Kiddushin in front of Eidim. And then she can become his wife. First ki yikach, and then uva alea. That's the process that has to be taken. So why is this all so important? Because that is what a marriage is. A marriage is an incredible transition for a young man, or for a man, and for a woman. Moving from a space where your Rishut HaYachid is occupied by nobody but yourself and Hashem. That's a Rishus HaYachid. A bachelor has his Rishus HaYachid. Who's in his Rishus HaYachid? Nobody except himself. And now all of a sudden he's bringing somebody else into his Rishus HaYachid. That's what marriage is. That's the Rambam that we learned on Daf Yud. Al ken yazov ish et aviv et imo v'tavak b'ishto v'hayu lebasar echad. They become one basar. So it's not that I'm in a semi-public domain. Before I was in my own private Rishut HaYachid, And now I'm in a family situation. I've got a wife as well. Now you're still in Reshut HaYachid. And your wife now occupies the Reshut HaYachid with you because you're Basar Echad. And how do you become Basar Echad? And here we said the Ramban's attack on Rashi, it's not that you become Basar Echad because you have children and create a family. You become a Basar Echad because of the commitment to want to be with this woman. Always you make her part of your Reshut HaYachid. That's what becomes important. So that one has to be aware that in building a home, you're expanding the Reshut HaYachid, you're expanding the sense of Yachid. There's an important concept in ego management, which Reb Shimon Shkop develops in the Akdama to Sha'arei Yosher. Rav Kook talks about it as well in the Shmona Kavotzim, where you expand the sense of self, you don't deny it. And it comes to a point, Reb Shimon Shkop says, where your sense of self becomes universal. You think, who am I? When you start off, you look in the mirror and you say, that's me. And what about other people? No, that's not me, that's them. The expanded ego is the universal ego. Who am I? I am everything that is included. Everything is part of me and I am part of everything. Those people on the left wing are not them. Those people on the right wing are not them. We're all me. This is all part of who I am. Those differences break down and there's a sense of me. So with the wife is the first step in expanding the sense of I to the sense of we, but still remaining in Reshut HaYachid. This is still a place where my wife and I don't have to worry about image. When we go out, we worry about image. She puts on makeup, he puts on a nice suit of clothes, they deal with image. At home, there's also a certain amount of image, a different discussion. But primarily in terms of how we are with one another, it's not about how we look. It's not about how we're perceived by others. It's not about our public image. It's about who we really are. That's what intimacy is. And for that, you've got to be able to bring a woman into a Reshut HaYachid. And when you come to a situation, as the Rambam says, a man can't have relations with his wife in public spaces, in the marketplace or in the streets or in the gardens or on the beaches. You can't do that. Why? Because that's a Reshus HaRabim, that's Prizut. Shelo Yera'eh Kiznut, that becomes like a form of sexual licentiousness, which is not acceptable because it's Prizut. You're breaking down the barriers of what should be done in the privacy of Reshut HaYachid and what may be done in the publicity of a Reshus HaRabim. And we need both. You need to operate in Reshut HaRabim. You can't live your life in a Reshut HaYachid, but you also can't live your life in a Reshut HaRabim. You've got to develop yourself. After 120 years, what do you take with you to the Olam HaEmet? Not your image. All you take is your Reshut HaYachid. All you've got is your Reshut HaYachid. How have you built your Reshut HaYachid? How have you built your personal identity, your private sense of being, not how people see you? How have you built who you really are? Because that's what you take forward. And it's the same with nations and with communities. Who are you? Not how do you engage with the world. That's a different issue. How does the world experience you? That's a different issue. But who are you at your core? What are your values? What is your culture? What do you believe in? What do you stand for? A community, a shul. Who are you? What do you stand for? What are your values? Yes, it's Yiddishkeit, it's from Yiddishkeit, it's Shmiras HaMitzvos, that's fine, that's common to all the communities. But what differentiates you? Why do you set yourself up as a separate community? Is it just a physical boundary? You're just in an area where there are no other shuls? Or is there a boundary that is governed by values and beliefs and by what you stand for as a community? A community, a family, a nation, an individual. Who do I stand for? And when you bring somebody into that area which is about who you are and what you stand for, that's intimacy. And that's personal intimacy, that's familial intimacy, that's social intimacy, that's communal intimacy, and there's national intimacy, where people can behave together. In Eretz Yisrael, we can behave in a way which we don't behave when we're out in Chutz La'aretz. We're among family. We have to have that relaxed capability to be able to be a little bit more focused on who we are rather than how we appear and how others perceive us in our own home, whether it's a national home or a communal home or a familial home or a home of intimacy between a husband and wife. And that's why Rav used to punish people who used to break down those barriers, because he understood so fully well what the slippery slope is when you start breaking down barriers of identity. And when you become global in your thinking, when you can become global in your morality, when you become global in your behavior and you don't allow the space for individual identity to develop and to become strong, that's the beginning of the erosion, in fact, of all morality and of all ethics.